Okay, thanks folks for joining us. I'm very excited to say we have Dr. Sonya MacParland with us today, who I'm sure most of you know or have met or know her name. She's very well known in CanHepC and in this community. Before we get started, I do just want to acknowledge that I'm joining from Toronto here at TCLD, and Toronto is the traditional territory of many Indigenous communities, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. I know I've been in Toronto a few years and it feels like home to me, so I'm very grateful for all of the people who've been caring for this land for time immemorial. And if you don't know which territory you're joining from, I would encourage you to look and find out. I'm going to hand over to Sonia today, who is going to talk about research funding, which, as you know, is a very important part of being a researcher. And when we were preparing for this webinar, a lot of people told me that she is the queen of receiving research funding. So she's here to hopefully share some of her secrets today. But I do think we'll have plenty of time for questions. So I think we can take them throughout, but also if you'd like prefer your question to be anonymous, you can just message me. Um, and yeah, I'll pass it over to Dr. MacParland. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And just before I get started, I have been in, or I was in the CanHepC program starting in 2006 when I was in my PhD. So I'm officially a CanHepC dinosaur. Um, so one of the things I just want to flavor for is what are the stages, career stages you guys are in, and have you guys applied for any grants? So is it possible just to go around and hear what your guys' experience level is and what you're hoping to kind of get out of this conversation? Just a quick one. We can start with Javaria.
Hello, Sonia. I'm a postdoc and I've applied to a few fellowships and I've helped write a few grants with a kind of a PI, but I haven't personally applied to any grants. Yeah.
Tamara?
Yes, I've applied to many grants, I guess, in my clinical work with pharmaceutical companies, which is very different. And then with my own PIs, we've applied to a couple of grants and things like that. But yeah, and I'm a master's student.
Excellent. Okay. Farzana?
Hello, my name is Farzaneh. I'm fourth year PhD student in biomedical sciences in Montreal, and I haven't applied for any grant myself yet.
Okay, great. Ayub?
Hi, I'm Ayub. I'm a fourth year PhD student as well. I haven't yet, but I'm actually in the process of starting to write a grant about my project. So
Excellent.
perfect.
Brendan?
Yeah, hi. I'm a postdoc, also in Montreal. I've applied for a few different grants. I have my own FRQS and CNHR to support my postdoc here, and I applied for another CHR Catalyst grant that we got last year as well. So yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Congratulations. Manila?
Hi, sorry, I'm in the middle of doing experiments in the lab. Uh, yeah, so I'm a PhD student in the Sagan lab. I've written a couple of different fellowship applications,
Yep.
and I've helped out with like reviewing grants that my PI has written, so I've kind of seen what they should look like.
Super cool. Okay, Mohammed?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mohammed. I'm a PhD student from McGill University, working with Dr. Chiara Sebastiani. This is my last year in my degree. Just submitted my thesis, waiting for the results. Yeah. So I missed the questions, maybe what you need to hear and what you do. So
Have you
that's it.
applied for grants yet, or are you starting to think about doing
For postdoc?
that? Yeah, or have you participated
No,
in writing grants with your PI or anything like that?
no, not yet.
Okay,
No.
cool.
Thank you.
Simone?
Hi, my name's Simone. I just finished my PhD. I'm in Dr. Carla Coffin's lab. I've helped with some grant writing. I've received CIHR fellowships for master's, PhD, and postdoc. So I'm curious to see how it is for grant writing as a PI or even as a postdoc.
Cool. And where are you, Simone?
I'm in Calgary right now. I'm just waiting for all my visa stuff to go through for my postdoc.
Yeah, I just
Yeah.
saw they reopen everything. Like I'm starting to get emails from NIH again. So are you gonna go, where are you gonna go for postdoc?
So everything kind of fell apart in June, July for the NIH, and with all the shutdowns and everything, I don't think it's the best to go. They can't even accept my CIHR over there.
Oh, I see.
So I'm interviewing in Australia right now. So we'll see. Yeah.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah.
Uh, um, um, anybody else? If you don't have your camera on, I figured I just wouldn't ask you, but anybody else want to give context? Carla? No. No. If you're doing experiments, it does. No, it's okay.
Oh, sorry, I moved my. No, no, I'm not. I'm literally in my desk, but
Oh, yeah.
I cannot. I don't know why it looks like that. Why it's not facing myself instead of elsewhere. Anyway, I'll try to fix it. But so my name is Carla. I'm also in my last year of PhD. The experiences that I have had when it comes to funding is writing grants for my master's, for an internship that I had the opportunity to take, and for a PhD position. I currently am not working on one, however.
Okay, cool. All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so guys, interrupt me. You guys can see my.
I cannot see. I cannot hear, but I don't know if it's me.
No,
No, I can't see
it's
either, I
me
think.
too. I think we just lost
Oh, okay.
connection for a second, so we'll just give her a moment to come back. Sometimes the Wi-Fi here at UHN likes to play
Okay.
games.
Oh, it's in my phone. Sorry. Sorry.
Sonia, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I think you're back now. We just lost your connection for a minute, but
Oh,
if you want to reshare your slides and start again, that'd be excellent.
awesome. Okay, and here we go. All right.
Okay,
Is
looks
this
great.
better?
Yeah, thank you.
I'll just turn my screen off. I'm gonna plug in somewhere else so that maybe my internet needs to be better. 1 second. All right. Bear with me 1 second. All right. Okay, so what I wanted to go through today was some of the strategies to improve competitiveness and really the considerations for the different unique funders that sometimes we encounter here in Canada. And so first of all, the important thing to consider, or that we always consider when we're first submitting a grant, is understanding each of the agencies. So I hear some of you have CIHR grants, some of you have NSERC, and some of you have industry grants. And they all have different initiatives, and you really have to match the proposal and the proposal language to the program goals. So one of the things that we've found is that each kind of agency almost speaks a different language, if that makes any sense. So I'll go into some of the main agencies like the NSERC and CIHR, but then we can talk a little bit about some of the philanthropic agencies, which I think has been kind of some of the most interesting experiences that we've had having patient partnered grants. Okay, so the three kind of agencies that everyone probably here would know well is the CIHR. It's health focused. It's very focused on feasibility. It's very data heavy. There's NSERC. It's focused on research excellence and highly qualified personnel training, and the Social Science Health Research Council, which is societal relevance and scholarship. And so what does that mean? So it just means that the focus of each of the grants has different weight, kind of has different priorities. So for CIHR is very focused on strong data and feasibility. So for example, when you start to write a CIHR grant, first of all, the grants themselves, and I'll go into how that's structured, but the grant itself is 10 pages. And within that 10 pages, there's about space for 5 or 10 figures. And so you spend a lot of time talking about the data that you already have and the feasibility. And sometimes people joke, I'm sure your PIs joke about the fact that for CIHR, most of the AIM 1 is already done. So you submit your CIHR as your AIM 1 is kind of put together and about to be submitted to a funding agency. And so NSERC, though, which is a pool of money that is more focused to engineering research and natural sciences, it's really focused on your actual research program and how you're going to train the next generation of highly qualified personnel. So these are 5-page proposals. Maybe there's space for 1 figure, and actually the pool of money is smaller for NSERC. The interesting thing with NSERC for people that are applying or thinking about starting their new lab is that NSERC really focuses on both highly qualified personnel training, but also on fundamental biology and cell systems. So when people like myself, we write an NSERC grant, we kind of remove all of the, say, for example, I'm studying the liver cancer ecosystem. You wouldn't talk about liver cancer and what the impact of that research is in terms of curing liver cancer. You talk about in NSERC about the outcome is really understanding the fundamental biology of how T cells become exhausted and become non-responsive to their antigen, right? So you're talking about fundamental biology. So even the language kind of changes. And so but both have kind of scoring grids, and I'll go into those scoring grids, and the panels in the similar way meet together, and the reviewers will kind of give you a score and then they refine it. So oftentimes there'll be people on the panel that have seen the grant if it happens a second time, and those people will remember it and be able to kind of comment and maybe even do something called rescuing a grant if they've seen it for a second time. So is there any questions about that? No? Okay. So in CIHR, the main focus is on kind of the significance, the approach, the impact. That's really critical. And it includes, you have to include really fine details on the controls, on the pitfalls and alternative approaches. So when you write a CIHR grant, when you write your aim, the last part of every aim is what happens if everything I think doesn't happen? What's the backup? So say, for example, we're talking about making sure, looking at the T cell receptor repertoire in the tumor microenvironment. And we're going to use this approach that sorts the T cells out of the tumor. The alternative approach, you kind of have to think about what the reviewers are going to think about. So if the reviewers think, well, what if there isn't enough T cells in the tumor, which is like kind of a low-hanging fruit question, you've already addressed it in the alternative approaches. If we don't have enough T cells in the tumor, we'll go and use a spatial approach where we know we can pull them out and we can see where they are. So in the way you kind of structured is you say what you think you can show, and then underneath it you say, well, we think that our finding will be rigorous because we have these controls. We've separated our males and females into 2 groups, so we know that we can pull out sex as a variable in this research. And we have these backup approaches that we know that exist. We know we can call these in if, for example, when we start to really pull out the N of 10 from our, because you're always going to have preliminary data to show it's feasible to look at a T cell in a tumor, but you may not have enough to really be powered to look statistically. So you say, well, here's my alternative approach. I would do this spatially. So for some grants, that can actually be a huge chunk of the grant itself. And I'll show you an example of that from us. And then there should be a really polished structured abstract, which you actually don't see in some of these grants where you apply to industry, where you apply to philanthropy, and even when you apply to NSERC. NSERC is more of a broad 5-year program. Okay. So for NSERC, it's really about how you're going to train the next generation of highly qualified personnel, basic scientists, engineers, kind of translational researchers, but not clinical researchers. You show the continuity of your research program. So you talk about what you've done 5 years ago, whereas the CIHR grants, like the main grants are called project grants, you're talking about an individual project. So the power or the weight is really on the feasibility, the controls for your individual project. For the NSERC, it's all about your research program. Like, who have you trained? What new skills did they develop, and how did that help their career? What are the different career paths and opportunities you're going to offer to your students? So there's 2 pages straight of these are the kind of experiential training opportunities you would offer to the students. And so what I generally do is I will make bins of this information and kind of repurpose it for different grants. So you always kind of say, how would you train students? Sometimes for NIH, it'll be 3 pages long. For promotions in the university, it'll be shorter. But if you have those bins, you kind of plop them in to each of these grants. For CIHR, it's a very small, unless you're doing a training program, which Karen, you'd be writing the renewal for. If you're right, then you would have that huge kind of training component. But for a project grant, it's, we'll need these many students and they'll train and they'll do this specific question. And in NSERC, you also show the highly qualified personnel outcomes and skill development. And the nice thing about having these discovery grants, so the difference between a CIHR grant and an NSERC grant is that CIHR grants are for about $1 million to $1.5 million over 5 years. The NSERC grants are maybe $30,000 to $50,000 a year, but it opens up for your students then to be considered NSERC students, so they can apply for both NSERC PhD funding as well as CIHR PhD funding. And so strategically, even for kind of translational, and like I'm a transplant PhD, so I'm embedded in a clinical program. This NSERC program has helped me fund several students who still work on translational research, but their proposals are more focused on the fundamental cellular systems that would be interacting within that program, with no mention of the outcomes in terms of curing disease. So strategically, often people, when they're being recruited in, we tell them, apply for your NSERC first before you have your CIHR, so that for the NSERC panel, they don't kind of consider you as a CIHR person. So then you can after you get your NSERC, you get your CIHR. So it's kind of nice to time them that way. Any questions? Nope. Okay, cool. So it's important to have equity, diversity, and inclusion. And those are, especially in NSERC discovery grants or any kind of training program grants, you talk about how you would engage students that are from equity deserving groups. And sometimes actually your university or your institute will have these policies already in place. We search for students in these populations, we advertise in these places, we make sure that we have a virtual component to our lab meetings so that people can attend when they have family commitments or when they're on maternity leave or something like that. So these, like, kind of writing the equity, diversity, and inclusion practices within your kind of lab, your toolbox of your different sections that you'd write for your grant kind of folders that would be placed to a larger degree in your NSERC discovery, but you kind of whittle it down to a smaller amount for your CIHR. But for NIH as well, those grants, you would have these sections. So kind of considering equity, diversity, and inclusion is very important. Okay. So one of the things that people always kind of, and I found this my first year, the first year I laughed when I told Duveria, I applied for 19 grants and I got one need-based grant for $1,500. And that was the whole first year. So, you know, what you really have to do is the more grants you apply for, the more experience you get in refining these sections, getting feedback, making sure your questions are super crystal clear. We'll talk a little bit about making sure the aims aren't interdependent, and then really understand what they're looking for. You know, I don't even know what the percentage success rate for 19 grants and getting one need-based grant. But now my success rate is much higher just with experience. So I would encourage you, if you're, you know, as you're becoming a new PI, and even when you're in postdoc, try and get as much experience writing grants and writing sections of grants. And I'll share some tricks of the trade that might help even strengthen your PI's grants. And so what I did then was I applied for pilot grants and preliminary data grants. So what happens when you apply for CIHR as a brand new PI is every single aim has to have preliminary data. So as a new PI, the nice thing is that there is every new PI that submits a CIHR grant, their grant is discussed. But that discussion often is aim one, sub aim A. Can they do that? Can they do this? Can they do that? So you have to show really strong feasibility. The only way to really do that is to collect preliminary data. The only way to do that is to have money to spend. And so if you've kind of worked through your startup funds, these smaller groups, you know, that are these are non-renewal grants. These are one-time grants. And often they're also need-based grants. And so these small pockets of like $25,000, $50,000, they will build up enough preliminary data for you to be able to show that each of these aims, you have a little bit of, there's feasibility. So what I mean by feasibility is we say, okay, we're going to look at the liver cancer niche using spatial transcriptomics. And so what a reviewer will say is what tissues will they use? Can they access the tissues from a clinical biobank, or does it have to be stored at a certain temperature? Will the RNA quality be sufficient? They just kind of say, can you even pull these cells out of liver? So you only have to show one, but that one can be very expensive, right? So you say, we're going to show this. We know we have access to these number of samples, and we've run a pilot with one of these tissue slices, and boom, here's our data quality. We're pretty confident that this is going to be fine. And so using these provincial and foundation funding, industry funding, you can create all that preliminary data for your national grants. So those were part of my 19 in the first year. Still didn't get them to the second year, but still. And then also internal and bridge funding. So one of the things that people kind of debate is whether you should go through internal peer review processes or whether you should just write it yourself. I like the idea of internal peer review because it gets someone else looking at your grant. The challenge is that, you know, people may not have time to look at your grant. And then they may not provide, you may be depending on really great feedback. They may not provide great feedback. So sometimes there are, for example, in our institute, there's a service that you can pay for. That's $40 an hour. And they will read through your grant. They'll give you an X number of hours, as opposed to a colleague that very seldomly is going to be able to clear 8 hours in a day. So I'll actually pay for a day of work from this service, which is called our strategic office. So there'll be an analyst that goes through it, and they will go through it as kind of a reviewer just to say, here's a paragraph that we think you should turn into a table, a visual, and this is going to make it less tiring for the reviewer. So sometimes making that investment in hiring someone, and you don't have to hire, like I wouldn't hire someone within a program to be a writer for the whole time, but I would certainly invest, you know, $1,000, $600 in having someone go through the grant for, it just being smooth and easy to read. Because the one thing you have to picture for CIHR, and I think a bunch of your PIs might be doing it right now, is people usually have 8 grants. They usually spend tops 5 hours per grant. So they really have to capture your grant right away. What's the question? What's the impact? What's the question? What's the impact? And what's the outcome? So I don't know. I see your guys' question. Does every university have this service? So I don't know. So I'm talking about our research institute. This is Toronto General Research Institute. They have a strategic office. And so there's offices, for example, that help write these big grants. They help write the CFI grants. They'll kind of guide you a little bit through your Canada Research Chair proposal. Like they have that content, like the equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. They also talk about all the facilities. So that they say, especially when you write a Canadian Foundation for Innovation. So when you first start your lab, you have the NSERC, which is your operating grant. You have your CIHR, which is also an operating grant, but then you also have infrastructure grants. So say, Simone, you're going in and you need a fancy flow cytometer. There is a program in which the provincial government matches 40%. The federal government also puts in the other 60%, and then, 40%. And then the vendors themselves give a 20% discount so that they can build this Canadian innovation infrastructure. So in that situation, often your university will already know who has what equipment, right? So because they have to make a case for the fact that exists, that you want this new fancy flow cytometer and that it's going to be used enough. So they efficiency and a case for the fact that it's even necessary. But I don't know if every university has these writing services. I know that we write a New Frontiers in Innovation grant. So those are ones that are like $24 million. There was people that we got referred to that they wrote full time. So there should be someone in your strategic office or in the kind of the business logistics office that should know who could potentially give you 8 hours. And the important thing is that you either engage with a really cool and generous colleague, potentially someone who's more like closer to retirement because they have a lot of time. Like Thomas Michalak would read any of your grants, and he's really great. Myron Cebulski, who is our department head, would read through everybody's grants, but a lot of people just don't have the bandwidth to put 8 hours in. So talking to your office about that. Yeah, internal peer review. The nice thing about internal peer review is it makes you eligible sometimes for bridge funds. And then, so if you have internal peer review and you've gone through that, then sometimes your department will say, now that makes you eligible to have bridge funds if you don't get the grant. So it's always great. The only thing is, and we're trying to work through it in our department, and I'm trying to understand like what would be some of the barriers to people wanting to do internal peer review. And it's internal competition. So people sometimes don't want other people reading their grants. Not all the time, but there are some people that are not comfortable. So in that situation, it's about doing internal peer review in a way that the PI really feels comfortable, Any questions? But yeah, I actually feel pretty strongly that if someone is recruiting people in, they should have all these resources kind of available. And I know that's the CIHR New Investigator Forum, like the CIHR Immunology New Investigator Forum, they have these kind of packages of information and kind of like, what do you do in your first year? That doesn't really exist at the institute level, like the individual institute level, but I know I have a flash drive of it if anybody wants to see what and is anyone attending the New Investigator Forum, or does anyone know what these New Investigator Forums are? No. So, no. Has anyone attended them? No. So first time I'm hearing about it. Yeah, so this is an important one actually, Simone. And it's a great way to meet people who are senior postdocs and certainly new faculty. So it's called the NIF, the New Investigator Forum. Most institutes prioritize brand new faculty. One second, I just got to like prioritize brand new faculty. But what it is that when I was in my first year of faculty, we went to Quebec, and then everyone did like this quick elevator pitch. It was all the new immunology. There you go, Karen, great job. So if you can, people that are in molecular medicine, they have a new investigator forum for that. Cancer research, health systems, they have a new investigator forum for that. And so they try and mix people of similar backgrounds and expertise. And then they just talk about these kind of things, like how do I apply for my first grant? They actually have a grant kind of proposal exercise where you go through kind of what a stinky grant looks like, what a good grant looks like. I won't be able to go through all that today, but I'll try a bit. Okay. But these are ways for you to network right away, because it can be kind of isolating that first year. And so setting up this network and meeting with people and understanding like, hey, here's this grant, let's apply for it together. It's kind of cool. Okay. All right. So, and I'll provide all these slides, so maybe I'll just skip through them, but in general, a CIHR format, just trying to move this step around and move you guys. Okay. So in general, for a CIHR operating grant, you have 10 pages. The first page is a significant and overall hypothesis. Sometimes having a visual here is really important. So it talks about kind of what you ultimately want to get to at the end of your 5-year program. Your objectives, they have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they have to be achievable. So in these panels, they literally say, this is too vague a hypothesis, it's not testable, please come back next year. And so having a testable and a concrete hypothesis is important. Having background is important, and then experimental plan. The progress actually is also, there's a 2-page part of the CIHR grant that you talk about your progress. So when you say, for example, when I submit grants, I submit them with myself. I have an immunology lab. Gary Bader has a computational biology lab, but some of my students actually do their own computational biology. And then I always have a clinician partner who is a surgeon scientist, et cetera. So there's this 2-page progress report where you can say, you really talk about how these collaborations are already established and how they were established and how the framework looks. And you can just explain your team a bit more. You have a half page where you talk about your specific aims, and you really have to make sure that they're kind of non-connected. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then you have 6 pages where you have your research design. You always talk about your expected results and significance, and then always provide alternatives in case the research takes an unexpected turn. So try and get in the head of your reviewer. So this is why it's kind of fun to do reviewer and training programs or observerships, because you can see that it's just basic questions. Can you pull a macrophage out of a tumor? Can you get enough patients? Is this a disease where you can even separate by sex, right? And so some of these are important, are questions that really, it's tricky to answer them without, it's tricky to answer, it's tricky to identify these pitfalls before, and so you just kind of lay them out there. And you can always say, we're going to leverage other funds to ask it this way, but it's important to think that you've considered it all. Your time considerations and expected outcomes and future directions, you put a nice little timeline and then you summarize it. And this is generally, so this might change for next year because they may decide, okay, we're going to give you an extra page for figures, but in general, your research design and methods is 60% of your grant, okay? And so here's some of the evaluation criteria. I wanted to show you guys this because it's kind of cool, because it shows the difference between kind of the different grant priorities, or what they kind of consider is important. So the excellence of the researcher is important, but look, it's not the most important. The most important is there's equal weight between the merit of the proposal and then the training of highly qualified personnel, right? So if you look through this, some of this is going to be not really applicable in your first year, and because you won't have that many trainings. But when you have a summer student, it's important for you to track where they go on to, right? And it's important for you to get them to summarize what they did. Okay, because you can include that and kind of say, HQP generally move on to positions that require skills gained through the training they received in your lab. So if it's a master student that learned flow cytometry and applied it a summer student that learned flow cytometry with you and then used it in their master's, you've checked that box. You're now strong in the past training of highly qualified personnel. And then your training philosophy that you're going to expose them to all these different environments. So even when you mentor students in postdoc, I would include that as a new PI and just say, I mentored this student in postdoc as an example of the success of my past training of highly qualified personnel. They went on to do a master's and they used skills that we gained. The merit of the proposal, you can see that the merits, or what people consider as kind of strong for NSERC, is not exactly the same as in CIHR. So the long-term vision and short-term vision are clearly defined. So there's a long-term vision, whereas CIHR, it's mainly the project, it's mainly the three kind of main aims that are described. In every situation, the methodology is clearly defined, it's appropriate, and that's going to be important regardless of how you apply, like what organization you apply to. And you always want to make sure that someone looks through the grant for clarity, because clarity does not require, they don't have to have the expertise in your area to say, this is clear what their question is and what outcomes they're looking for. Yeah. Any questions? If you have questions, just yell because I can't see the chat. Okay. So for CIHR, again, really important to focus on impact and feasibility. So, you don't really have to talk about feasibility in NSERC because you have such a small area. But the feasibility, like every assay you propose in a CHR grant, you either have to have data for, or alternatively, and I'll show you this, you can have a collaborator provide you the data, you acknowledge them, provided in collaboration with Adam Gehring, but you have to show that you can either do it or your co-applicant or collaborator can do it and have some kind of figure to that. And that you have the right expertise within the grant. So within NSERC, I would just say in collaboration with this person, and I'll find a collaborator on this. But in CIHR, you have to be very specific about it. I'll share these slides if you want them. But this is kind of just to show the differences in. So when you're applying to a grant program, just make sure you look at these evaluation criteria. For example, we had one last year. It was really fascinating because I was on the grant panel. I had applied for this grant. I was on the grant panel. And I noticed when they first sent out the list of the grants that we were going to review in person, I was like, oh, my grant was triaged. It was a philanthropic organization. And then someone had rescued the grant because there's a huge component of patient partnership in the grant. So some people were taking an aim from one grant, plopping it into this grant, but you really had to spend a lot of time describing how patients would be involved in the research. And that's something that I spent a lot of time doing. And then we got the grant, even though it was originally triage. So, looking at the evaluation criteria, it was very clear that there was going to be a patient on the panel. So I wrote that section for the patient. So if you look at the evaluation criteria, they sometimes even tell you for CIHR, they'll tell you the evaluation group from last year. It won't necessarily be the same one, but you'll get a flavor for who's on it. And you can even just talk to the person. Like one of the things that I often do is I'll talk to the program officer, or I'll talk to the chair of the evaluation committee and just say, what's the vibe there? Is it data heavy? Is it impact heavy? Blah, 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 blah. Okay. Okay, so this is cool. This is something that Rachel, who is a CanHepC graduate, set up. So Rachel was working on the CHR grant with me and set up this kind of component tracking. So here are all the different important parts of your research proposal. She set this up as a Google Doc, as a Google sheet. And so everything is there, there's tracking of when it started, when it's done, how much needs to be there, so that everybody, and you can tag people in, especially when you're writing a grant, and there's different people kind of being delegated responsibilities. It's very nice to have a visual to say, here's the deadline, here's where it started, and here are all the different components. And then you have, I'll show you kind of a link to the Google Doc. I might have to like stop sharing and reshare, but I'll show you this. So having something like this where you can track the components makes it much easier. And then what we really start with kind of the big picture. What are the main questions we're going to ask? What are the aims? Making sure the aims are not dependent on each other, who are going to be the co-applicants, and things like what letters do we need. So having something like this where you can do a checklist and track the components is important. And then I often contact or talk to the program officer or the person that is kind of in charge of the grant, and then kind of find out about the vibe, the fit, the program priorities. And so you need to write a really strong specific aims page, because for LOIs, that specific helps people choose who might be your reviewer. So, it's important to kind of list, you can change your summary page to line up with your ultimate proposal between registration and submission, but and you can even change the title, but it's important to kind of make sure that you're spending a bit of time making it nice and clear, because it does help them choose people that will review. And so I'm going to try, yeah, I'm going to stop sharing for a second and see if I can show this Google Doc, because it's kind of fun. Disconnect. Oh, yeah. Okay. Am I sharing? Still sharing? No. Okay.
No.
So
No.
Yeah. See if it works. No, it's not working. Do I have it open? Okay. That's okay. I'll keep sharing. The main point I just wanted to make is, the way that we write grants and collaborative teams is we do them in Google. So we do them as a Google Doc, and so that everyone can collaborate and tag each other in. And then you're kind of not waiting for feedback, you're getting feedback in real time. And so it's a nice way to also versions. We already talked about preliminary data that shows feasibility and proof of concept and makes the reviewers relax. So especially for new PIs, that's important. It's important to have power calculations. So that's something that you see can be kind of a grant killer. If you don't have a power calculation, they'll just say, come back in 6 months. And so you don't really want to have that. Always have a power calculation, always have a milestones and timelines. Make it super easy to read. Like I said, we have a big problem all in basically the scientific community is people don't have time to read grants, people don't have time to read papers. So if they're reading a really complicated grant and they can't get their head around the jargon, they can't get their head around, what animal model is being used for what. So a lot of times people will actually provide the feedback in the panel, have a table of all your animal models and why you're using them, so try and just put things into a visual, leave some white space, and limit acronyms. Show your team expertise, especially as a new PI, the more people you have on, you're still the nominated PI, you're still, but you need to talk about what their track record is. Sometimes you're allowed to include letters of support. And then of course, make sure you get a good picture of the facilities in your institute. And then, what are your validation steps? What are your kind of backup plans? It's really important. It's important to budget properly. The one thing that I would tell everyone is that new PIs always under budget. They think that if you go in with a lower budget, it's not going to piss off the reviewers. The budget discussion actually is after, in CIHR, is after it's after they decide that the grant is fundable. You don't want to go in with something over $1.5 million because it goes to a different pool, but going in at 900 versus 1.1 is not going to change how your grant is reviewed because the discussion of budget is always later. Worst case scenario, they say, take out one of your research associates. You have too many research associates. You still get the grant. So even if you reach too high, they'll just cut it down a little bit. And try and really get a landscape of what things cost. It's good for you for the grant and the lab in general. Make sure you have the grant reviewed by experts and non-experts, just even for like typos and, like I said, turning something that's really complicated into a pretty visual. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is, the inevitable, which is what happens when it's not funded. First of all, like when I was a new PI, I have kids. They're generally well behaved, sometimes not. But whenever I would have a grant rejected, I would just take the rest of the afternoon off. I would meet my kid at school and take her to the park and swing her. And that would be fun. And so you have to take a moment to like lick your wounds, if that makes any sense. But then you have to go back and address every single critique point by point. Some of them will sting because it'll be like, you didn't label this figure right. And you're like, damn, that didn't sink your grant. They're just telling you that, right? There's other things that it's probably a feasibility issue. So, some of it will sting and you just have to be super kind of positive about it. Thank the reviewers for reading your grant. They took 5 hours out of their day. And then state the improvements really clearly. We added 3 more figures. I actually had a grant the other day that the reviewer, the PI was like, I was super excited. I'm super excited to address these critiques because I think it's going to be really fun. You guys suggested really fun experiments, and whether they were fun or not, like it put the review panel in a great mood. The worst thing you can do is say, I respectfully disagree with your assessment, because it's like, okay, well, I'm not the one being reviewed here. Like you can take or leave my suggestions, but like, putting the reviewer panel in a bad mood is never a good idea. And then improve your proposal clearly and directly. Never put in the same proposal twice. Make sure you've improved it no matter what, no matter if it was 3.5, right? Oh, sorry, 4.5, and you need a 4.6, you can still change some of the figures and make it look prettier. There's no good, because there will be people in the room that have, even though they're supposed to throw out the old grant, there were people in the room that have your grant from last year, and they will have your current grant, and they'll say, look, they just think it's a time thing. It's exactly the same. So, you really do want to change it, even if you think it's perfect. And then this is the last kind of thing I want to touch on is sometimes just being in the room is a really important way to understand how to write grants. So for CIHR, at least, there's a reviewer and training program. And also And that includes, which I just learned this, that they have both. You can apply as a mentee, so that would be you guys before you have a faculty position, and that lines you up to apply as an early career reviewer. So I would do both of these. The mentee option didn't exist when I was before I was a PI. Reviewer in training did, and it was really useful. It's just good to see what people talk about. And people talk about the strangest things, like if there's not enough white space, if there are typos, if people make the figures too small, and they like, those are kind of things that people will actually talk about. Like, so aesthetics are important, feasibility, lacking controls, not having enough detail. Like, that's all stuff that could be there and sometimes should be there, but and it's implied. Of course, I'm going to have controls, but you really do have to spell some of that out. And so it's good to be in the room. So I would encourage people as much as possible to apply to both be a mentee and to be the reviewer in training. And it's under it's the same place that you would apply for your CIHR postdoctoral and PhD fellowships, I believe. And I think that's kind of all I wanted to discuss. So I'm happy to stop sharing and hear your thoughts. Yep, I've noticed many CHR applications typically include 3 aims. I'm wondering, okay, so that's a good question, Ayub. So Ayub is wondering if you have to have 3 aims. So often it depends on what the aims are. I certainly have had grants where you have 2 aims and then you have sub aims. Especially, for example, one of the projects was, we map what it looks like in transplant rejection. We target the different immune cells, and then we're going to test it in the ex vivo system. The ex vivo system aim was very risky, so we turned that into aim 2B, so that it was very much kind of contained within aim 2. The most important thing is that no aim, because you can, what can happen is aim 3, you can sink the whole grant on aim 3. They won't just fund aim 1 and aim 2. So it's important, number 1, aim 1 versus aim 2 and aim 3, they should be standalone. They can't be interdependent. So you can't have to have the results from aim 1 to start aim 2 or aim 3. So they all have to have some feasibility data. And so definitely I've had, I think the recent grant actually has 2 aims. Yep. How does the resubmission of a grant work? Is it rejected and then there's a second round in which it could be accepted? Yes. So you can submit, Carla, a grant 5 times, right? But what you get is, if you submit the grant, you get a grade, and then you will get reviewer comments, or if it's kind of in the top third of the grants, you get the reviewer comments, plus you get the scientific officer notes. So that means it was discussed in person. So everybody's grants get reviewed, but only the top, let's say 40% get discussed in person. Then you go back and you can take a year and not resubmit it, or you can resubmit it next round. You could resubmit a grant 8 times, but probably by the 5th time, the panel itself will give you a clear indication, like, this grant is not going to be funded with this aim 3 as it stands. But for example, for NSERC discovery grant, you submit every year. For CIHR, it's every 2 years. When you resubmit, you can actually have a rebuttal where you address all the comments. And sometimes it's good to be strategic, because you can say, if it's the 3rd submission, you can add some of the things that you did for the 2nd submission as well, So, if somebody raises a question that is contrary to what the reviewers in the 1st submission submitted, you can kind of have a bit of a conversation where you said, well, actually, I included this control group based on the reviews of the 1st submission, and the reviewers in the 2nd panel disagreed. So what I'm doing is I'm doing both, right? And so you can kind of, because there will be people that review all 3 times. That's what CIHR tries to do. They try to make sure that there's someone that has some memory of your grant, and can comment on whether it's improved. And everyone sees the comments from, in order for you to put in a rebuttal, you have to include the comments from the last submission. So it gives a lot of context, right? And so kind of the more positive you are, the more grateful you are, the more effort you put into changing it, even though some of the suggestions will be a clear indication that the person didn't get the point of this part of your aim. You're a little bit humble. You say, this is a good point. Clearly, I needed to clarify the purpose of that experiment, and here it is. And so you don't change anything, but you acknowledge the reviewer question, because it may just speak to whether there was enough clarity in the grant, right? But sometimes it could speak to the fact that the person just didn't read it properly, but you still can't shut them down like that. Like, of course, as I said before, I did this, because you can't do that. You have to be very grateful and positive about it, because reviewers are going to make mistakes for sure. Yeah.
I have another question. Sorry.
Yeah.
I have another question. For the big rounds, such as CIHR and the answer, what's the panel? What does the panel look like? Is it scientists that are focused on the field, or is it everyone how heterogeneous is this panel?
So that is an excellent question. So there is the CIHR funding decisions database. So this is how you choose your panel. So if you go through at the day of funding decisions, I go through and I see who got funded and what their grants were. And then I decide that panel now has this focus. And so I go to that panel. So you can see the composition. If you search out the CIHR panel composition, it's available online. If you search then the funded grants by panel, you can see, and then you can see also the panel mandate. So I just became the research director for Transplant here at UHN. So I sit down with new PIs when they say, I have these questions. We actually sit down and we go through and we say, here's the keyword: islet, mito, transplant. And you see everyone that's been funded, and it's okay, this could be bioengineering or this could be clinical. Then we look at the panel composition, and I say, do you know anyone on this panel? And they're like, oh yeah, these are people that's somebody that has expertise that I see at a conference. I'm like, then that's your panel. If you don't know anyone on the panel and they don't go to the same conferences as you, then maybe that's not your panel. Ideally, you look at the mandate, you look at the composition, and then you look at who got funded. And within that, you'll find your niche. I submit to multiple panels. I submit to VVP, I submit to kidney, pancreas, and biomedical engineering, depending on what the question is. Generally, when you get old like me, you have to have 2 or 3 different operating grants at the same time. And so you would be in different panels. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Simone, how do you go about getting industry sponsored grants? So that's an interesting one. So you have to present at conferences and they come to you, or you hunt them down. But I've found the easiest way to, the only way that I've gotten industry sponsored grants is that I present at AASLD and then they come to me after, and that it comes from there. So when you have a paper, Simone, that is translational, you have to present at basic conferences, but you also have to present at clinical conferences where industry people are going to be there. You have to kind of speak to both audiences, even though you're going to prefer the feedback you get from the basic science conferences. Like I have 2 completely different slide decks. One's for clinical, one's for basic. And sometimes when I mix it up, then the clinical people kind of say this is too basic, or the basic people say like I want more details, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm just asking because I know Carla herself, she's a clinician, so she gets very different industry sponsored trials. A lot of it's clinical trials related stuff, but I know you're more basic science. So I was just wondering how you go about, I know you present your research, but do you also do they have any collaborations or anything that they come to you? They're like, oh, we want to do this.
Yes,
you have this.
they
Yeah.
do. That's exactly what they do. So, so there's a SRA I just signed off on today. And so what it is, it's the precision cut liver slices in PSC. So, and so I present the platforms and how they could be applied, and then people come up. And so at first, when I presented the 2018 paper, which is the Atlas, somebody from a company came and said, can you explain to us what disease our animal models best model? And so they came to me, I presented to them, they gave me some money, we worked together. And so but it all came from presenting at conferences, or even this one SRA now with Asperion. It was the patient partner actually that was presenting and said, so the more you present, the more you share data, the more you're kind of doing a collaborative model. Every now and then you're probably going to get burned. Someone's going to scoop you, but the benefit is that some people always know who you like if somebody's looking for who's doing this in PSC, that's Sonya. She has this and that. So the more open you are about what you're doing, more you put stuff on bioRxiv, the more you kind of like we tweet, or now we do a tutorial on LinkedIn. We say, this is the paper and here's why it should be important to you if you're like this, if you're like this, and here's some of our tools and stuff like that. So but as soon as you have something that you think, you can also just go to the industry partners and kind of say, hey, I know what you're doing. And we would do that if we like, I'm poised to do that if we ever run out of CIHR money. That's the plan. I go to 4 or 5 different companies and say, here's our platform, and I pitch our lab to them. Right now, we're okay funding wise, but as soon as the funding dries up, that's exactly what I'm going to do.
Cool. Thank you for that. Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Anytime. All right, and reach out by email or anything like that, because I'm happy to answer your question.
Great. Dean, maybe you could send your question by email, just because of time. But thank you so much, Sonya, and everyone else. I'll see you in Journal Club. Have a great day.
Bye. Have a great day.